sbam.org/COVID-19. Let's get started. Today is kind of an interesting day. Brian Callie, you are in your car again, but you've been sort of warning us that we're going to run out of money in the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program that happened this morning. What do you know about that, and what's likely to happen next?
Yeah, so this wasn't a surprise. We didn't know exactly when, although I will say that as we had promoted that Paycheck Protection website, we did a 2-week buy to direct people toward this program, and that ran out at 11:59 last night, and that ad buy. And the reason that we did that is because we thought it was going to last about 2 weeks, and that's how it did turn out. So we heard straight away this morning from one of our members that one of their banker friends had run into a message from the SBA saying that the program was closed. And so I know that obviously there's a lot of people that have anxiety about that, especially if you don't have money in your account. So I just want to review something real quickly here, that if you have been approved and you're just waiting for a closing, then you're okay. The fact that they closed down the program doesn't mean that you're not going to get to close. Once your guarantee approval comes through, if the bank has said you have been approved, then it's just a matter of scheduling your closing and the money will hit your account. If you haven't been approved yet, or you're not sure, that's something you do need to get an answer out of your banker for. So this is we don't think this is the end of the story, but there is a pause, and I do expect it probably will be a pause because advocacy work, and also some congressional activities have been underway for over a week now to try and take the next step.
And that next step, as we've been talking about it, is another somewhere between $200 and $300 billion to follow the first $350 billion in the Paycheck Protection Program.
Yeah, we think that that they're probably going to land at $250 billion has been the most common number that has been used. And you might ask the question, like, well, they just burned through $350 billion. What does $250 billion mean? Keep in mind that the Paycheck Protection Program was available to companies of up to 500 employees. And so that's pretty big. When you get up to 250, 300, 400, 500 employees, it's pretty big. Those are also the types of companies that probably had very strong commercial banking relationships. And so it's likely that that a lot of the bigger loans got in first. And so when they put more money into it, I think it's very plausible that the average loan size for this next round is going to be much smaller, and therefore it will last longer. So that's $250 billion is the number that we are expecting. It's not exactly clear how long, but I know running out. It's one thing to say I think it's going to run out, but once it does, I think the pressure really, really ratchets up on Congress. In fact, just today, SBAM, along with dozens of other business organizations, signed on a joint letter to our congressional delegation asking for them to separate this discussion out from all the rest of the Phase 4 stimulus package, which is going to take like a month to get done, and just deal with PPP. Paycheck Protection Program, the infrastructure is built, the banks are up and running. If they just put money into it, it'll start right back up again. And so it's a very efficient way to deal with it. It's been a lifeline to a lot of businesses, and we are expecting them to act post haste, or we're asking for that, and maybe being a little more insistent than what we normally are when it comes to our advocacy.
And that is really the advocacy voice that we've been talking about along the way. Actually, at the same time, or at least in the same day that the PPP ran out of money, so did the EIDL. Today, this morning, we're told that if you went to apply, so these are on the SBA website. The PPP is going through your bank. But if you were on the SBA website today, you would have been told that the program is no longer funding loans. So that was $8 billion. It was in the original appropriation. It was not in the CARES Act. It came first. And so essentially the same day the PPP runs out of money, so does the EIDL. So $8 billion there. And so anybody who, again, if you've got an application in, I think it wouldn't allow you to make a new application, but if you have one in, I think you should wait to hear from the SBA. Thank you for talking about the congressional delegation communication that we really ought to be making. I think we're going to encourage our members to reach out to their member of Congress, to encourage them to put more money into this. There's a patent unfairness right now. If either you didn't get there in time or your bank didn't get there in time. We know of some companies who have been waiting in line at their bank for a week or more. And I think some banks move faster than the others. So it will leave winners and losers in a way that was never intended if Congress doesn't put more money into that. So thank you for leading the way on that. It's interesting. Every once in a while you get somebody who really knows their stuff, and you want them to come back and talk about it a little bit further. And every once in a while you have an accountant who really knows how to communicate well and has a sense of humor and all that sort of thing. We're asking somebody to come back today. Brian, you want to introduce him?
Yeah, so you guys have met Jamie on a couple of different occasions. You've been on one of our webinars and previous briefing where we talked about the Paycheck Protection Program. I don't know if we ever said before that his firm is called Capital Corps, and he's a pro and he does this, and people pay him to give really good advice, and yet he's been willing to come on this on our webinars and our briefings to provide really very high level, sophisticated advice. And so I just want to point out that he actually does this for a living, and anybody who's in the market for an accountant, think about Jamie. But a question came up, and so we invited him to come back on because it has to do with the use of proceeds when it comes to the Paycheck Protection Program. So we know, and we've been talking about, how do you get 100% forgiveness, and it's getting back up to that head count the first 8 weeks after payroll. If you do after origination of the loan, you do certain things, you get full forgiveness. But what if you would rather not go back up to full strength right away? What are some of your options that you have? So let's say maybe forgiveness of the loan is not your top priority. Maybe having capital a little longer down the road is your top priority. And this is a low interest loan, and maybe it should be used, or you're considering using it in a different way. And so this has come up many times in the last couple of weeks that people have contemplated, like, I think I know how I want to use this money, but really, what are my options? And so with that, I'd like to kick it over to Jamie and see if you could maybe just talk a little bit about what somebody can do. What are some of the possibilities that you can do with confines?
Sure. Thanks again for having me back on, guys. And today is, it's a weird year, right? Because today is April 16th. I should be kind of hung over and not doing anything with the end of tax season normally on the 15th. But here I am still plugging away. So, this has come up a lot of times, even with my own clients, and discussions that we've had of, I want to wait till maybe I start operations again and wait till use the loan at that point in time. And so there's two, and I don't want to get too technical into this, just I want to keep it at more of a top level, but there's two covered periods that are discussed in the law. One of them is relative to the use of funds, and then one of them is used for the forgiveness of funds. So at the core, this loan is still a SBA 7A loan, which means that it's got certain uses that you can use under the SBA 7A guidelines. And they've defined in the law the covered period for the use of funds from February 15 to June 30th, 2020. And as long as you use it for the cost defined under 7A, but more importantly, the additional payroll cost and things, the rent and utilities, during that time period, you're not violating the law of the loan. So that's important to know, that you don't have, but if you don't use it during the 8-week period after you get the funds, it's just not going to be forgiven. So businesses have a choice to make on whether, as you said, Brian, what do we do with this? Do we just wait, or do we use it now to pay our employees? And we have to keep in mind what the Treasury Department has specified this throughout all of their guidance. The intent of this law was to get employees back on payroll. So they're going to err on the side of giving you favor as long as you do that. So that's where they've kind of expanded the rules to say that during both of these covered periods, you can only use this for 75% of your payroll costs, but there's still a covered period. So if you want to wait and hold off, you can. You just have to make sure that you use all the funds by June 30th, or that you've got some prior costs prior to the loan getting funded that you can apply it against that as well, or show that document that you had incurred those costs prior to getting the loan through that February 15th and June 30th timeframe. So I think that's important because businesses are making that decision. It's a 1% 2-year loan. That's what I'm telling my clients. It's an equal trade-off. The government is basically telling you, here, we're going to give you this money. You have to pay your employees. If you do that, then you don't have to pay us back. However, if you want to do it for other approved purposes, you can do that as well, but now it turns into a 1% 2-year loan. And so there's decisions that need to be made on what is best for your business. One of the questions that I'm getting constantly now is, well, what if I don't want to bring my employees back? Or what if my employees don't want to come back because it's cheaper, or they're getting better on unemployment than they would if I paid them? And I'm kind of replying back saying, your employees don't have a choice in the matter. You have to bring, if you want to get it forgiven, you have to bring them back, and you have to bring them back on day one to maximize out this forgiveness portion, if that's what's important to you. And then what I'm saying is then you notify unemployment that they're back on payroll and they lose their unemployment benefits. And so that's the trade-off. And I believe that when they were, the parties were arguing over the CARE Act, that was one of the things Republicans didn't like about the unemployment benefits, was it was going to make it more advantageous for people to stay on unemployment than try to go back to work. And we're kind of seeing that play out a little bit.
And actually, Jamie, yesterday we had Sean Egan from the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity on to clarify the other side of that equation, which is if you tell your employee that you'd like them to come back and they refuse, they will lose their benefits.
Right, absolutely.
That has to happen on the Leo side of the equation, and right. he verified that would be the policy.
Absolutely, and that was my. I'm glad. Thank you for confirming that. That's what I thought as well. But keep in mind, even though if you tell them that you're going to come back and they choose not to, and you don't pay them, then that's not forgiven. That's not part. So you still have to. I think one of the biggest things that employers have to wrap their head around, if they're going for the forgiveness, to maximize their forgiveness, they have to get their head wrapped around the fact that they're going to be paying employees to do nothing. And that's a hard concept for a lot of employers to think about, because I give you an honest dollar's pay for an honest hours of work, right? And now all of a sudden I'm giving you pay and I'm not getting any benefit out of it. But ultimately you have to think about it. You're not paying the employee. The government's paying you to pay your employee.
So Jamie, let's just run through a couple of quick scenarios on this on forgiveness. So
sure.
Forgiveness and permitted uses. So regardless of whether you bring people back right away, or maybe you wait a few weeks or a month before you do, regardless of when you do it, we do know that it has to be used, at least 75% of the proceeds have to be used on payroll.
Yes.
And so like your options then would be, I'm going to bring everybody back on my payroll day one, and then I'm gonna spend at least 75% of these proceeds on payroll for the next 8 weeks, and the other permitted uses that we talked about, rent and interest and utilities. And to the extent that I spend all the money in the 8 weeks on just those purposes and a 75-25 max, I get the loan forgiven.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yep.
And then, but if I've got some back pay before my origination of the loan, or maybe I want to wait one more month before I bring people back, I've got to expend all of the money before the 30th of June, which is the end of that covered period. And then there would be some sort of a proration, which I don't think we really know all the details about yet, but some sort of a proration based on how much was in that 8-week period and how much wasn't.
Yeah, well, what would happen in that case there is more than likely there's going to be an overlap between the 8-week and the June 30th date. So some of it's going to fall in that 8-week, and whatever falls in that 8-week is going to be eligible for the forgiveness side. So I don't think there's going to be, I think it's going to be an actual dollar for dollar within that 8-week period. So you've got to imagine it's two overlaps. And the thing that I want people to understand is that look back period goes, or that covered period goes back to February 15. Because again, part of the purpose of this loan as well, or if you look at the purpose of a 7A sometimes, is to help with some costs that maybe you've already incurred before you got the loan. So it indirectly, you could argue that. So what I'm telling my clients to do is and we've built out a spreadsheet that I believe that if people that were attended my webinar earlier are still waiting for me to give, which I will do by the end of the week, to do two kind of measurements. One, measuring your costs that you've incurred during the first covered period of the use of funds, and then do another calculation of the same expenses during that 8-week period, so that way you can identify that A, you've followed the law relative to using the funds, and B, what you've qualified for your forgiveness portion, or what's eligible for forgiveness. So those are, and then you've got the other test after you calculate the eligibility. Then you've got the other tests relative to full-time employment or full-time equivalent, and then the salaries. So those are, which will further reduce that eligibility step.
Hey, Jamie, talk a second about the spreadsheet. That, for those who weren't on the webinar, and again, we appreciate your willingness to sort of share at this level.
Sure. So what I had done is and part of it was I did it for my clients and actually for my own firm, is during the webinar we had talked about one of the things that people should be doing now is starting to go through the various calculations. Try to figure out what your full-time equivalents were during the look back period, or the elected look back period. Start to look at what your wages were in the first quarter and employees that you paid in the first quarter compared to what you have to do now. So that way you guys can start to plan on what you need to do and what steps need to be taken relative to making sure you maximize out the forgiveness, or at least you have an idea of what's not going to be forgiven based upon what you're planning on doing when you get the funds. What the spreadsheet does is kind of walk through a couple of those tests, and kind of, if you use it, it's not fully automated, but it does allow you to ultimately end up at a calculation allowing you to calculate what's going to be forgiven, what's not, the balance due, and it even has a quick little amortization calculation to tell you what your monthly payment's going to be for the 2-year period. So it's just something that I think a lot of people ask for, just because it helps them having to recreate the wheel. And again, I designed it just because I wanted to do something for my own firm and my clients, and so I'm willing to share it with your audience, and then anybody that asks for it. Really, just as I'm having another CPA kind of do a beta test for me to make sure I'm not missing anything, and then we'll make it available for at least for first round anyways.
All right, thank you so much, Jamie. Thanks for coming back and answering some questions.
Sure.
We'll make sure that that spreadsheet is on our website. Yep. We'll just call it Jamie's spreadsheet, and out there so people can find it. All right,
that's fine. You're quite welcome, guys. Everybody have a good day.
Thanks. So, Brian, just today, we hear that New York and California have extended their shelter-in-place orders to the middle of May. We heard just a little bit ago that Wisconsin has moved theirs out to May 26th. And at the same time, we hear that Michigan has joined in a coalition of Midwestern states to sort of coordinate this effort. Should we be nervous about this, or what do you think?
I want to make sure that people understand or get some perspective that even though we have an experience here in Michigan about what a stay-home order or a shelter-in-place order means, that there is no standard around the country. These mean very different things from state to state. So most states have a stay at home or a shelter in place order. Michigan is either the most restrictive or among the most restrictive in the country. So, so when you see something like California expanding theirs out to May 15th, if Michigan were to copy California's right now and match May 15th, what the experience here would be, that would be considered a somewhat of a reopening of the economy. Same for New York, same for Wisconsin. So, so as we consider these things, I mean, the first thing you do is you look at it and say, oh my gosh, is it going to be extended from May beyond? Well, there are still going to be restrictions after May. There's no question about that. It's not just going to be a light switch. And we've been saying that. I think that everybody knows that it's not just going to be turned on at some time. But as Ohio had said today, was that they're looking at starting the reopening process on May 1st. And the fact that we can already see what Wisconsin is doing between now and May 30th and get some sense for how open their economy will be during that time period. We know a lot about Ohio. In fact, we're big fans of the approach that they've taken in Ohio. Even if, on the particulars, what's open, what's not, there might be some disagreement, but it's been very, very clear, and or at least as clear as any, or clearer than most around the country. And so people take some comfort in that too. So now what was announced today was a compact of sorts. It's not, all right, let me not call it a compact, more of a partnership to start the process of reopening the economy here in the Midwest. There's a conglomerate out, or a group of states in the West. There's one on the East Coast, and now the Midwest coming together to make these decisions together. And there are 7 states, so it's Wisconsin and Ohio and Indiana, the ones that border Michigan directly, and then of course, and then Minnesota and Kentucky and Illinois being the others. So those are states that have a lot in common. Even Kentucky might seem like it's a southern state, but there's a lot of manufacturing in Kentucky, and so this is going to be I think it's going to make a lot of sense, and it will protect our border areas from having vast differences between policies, what happens in Michigan compared to what happens in Ohio, because we want to be careful as we're reopening. We're already struggling more economically than most places around the country with this pandemic. We certainly don't, during the reopening process, certainly don't want to put ourselves at a competitive disadvantage. So we got to do things that make sense and stop the spread of disease. But doing it or moving together with the Midwest, I think is going to, it's going to be a very positive experience for people in Michigan as compared to what might happen if we just went alone.
All right, good deal. I know that there is just a lot of anxiety. Yesterday in Lansing, a protest that was, aimed at saying we got to reopen this economy. And I think the approach we've taken is one that is maybe perhaps a little more responsible. We're not just flailing around screaming about, we got to reopen the economy. We're part of the conversation. We have to be sympathetic to the challenge of people are dying in this case, and but we also can't let it go on so long that the economy dies. And we know that every day that passes, more and more small businesses will not come back from the edge. Earlier today, we had a board meeting, and it was so interesting to listen to our board members' stories. Some are thriving in this because it gives them business opportunities, and some are really struggling with it. And that's just a microcosm of what's going on among small businesses all across the state.
Yeah, and while it's true that there are some businesses that just the nature of what they do are busier right now than they normally are or would be, but of course that's the exception to the rule. I mean, the vast majority of small businesses, their very survival is threatened right now, and so these reopening decisions that are happening on a lot of different levels. You know, we see the national discussion, we see these regional discussions. Of course, we've got our own debates within our own, the confines of our own state, but also within industries. And I think what's going to be interesting over the next couple of weeks, and discussions that SBAM is very much plugged into and engaged directly in, is what kind of an approach to take. And of course, we look at everything from the lens of a small business owner. So that's what we want to make sure that these things are feasible, that there are some things that might be feasible and necessary, frankly, for when you have tens of thousands of employees that are all together. A lot of small businesses don't carry that type of risk, and therefore the requirements ought to recognize that in some way. And then the other thing that we're really pretty concerned about is the demand on personal protective equipment. So this would be, you've heard about this in the hospital context, surgical masks, the N95 mask, which wouldn't really be necessary for most industry, but the surgical masks that you see people wearing around. In Asian countries, we've seen people taking these types of steps for a long time. But to the extent that that is a requirement or a preference here, it's an extraordinary amount of pressure on a system, on a production system that has had a hard time keeping up with just the healthcare requirements on personal protective equipment. So as we open up this door, it's one of the things that we're trying to really sound the alarm on. Is we don't disagree that this personal protective equipment is necessary, but we also don't want to get to a point where we say, okay, here are the conditions to opening up, and nobody thought to figure out how much of the personal protective equipment we are going to need and where we were going to get it from. Because I could really see this being a major problem for our small businesses, that they'll find themselves at the end of a very, very long waiting list.
So let me say two things relative to that. One of them is, one of the value propositions of this association is that we take the buying power of our members and we get them a deal they can't get on their own. And that really does speak to who is going to get access to personal protective equipment in a market that's very, very tight. And I think the answer is the big guys will. And so we will, we're already doing some work right now to identify sources and to begin to put together a buying group around personal protective equipment. The other thing is, Brian mentioned, we have stories to tell. And as we represent small business in the course of this policy discussion, it's better to have data than it is to have anecdotes. It's nice to have both. We have a survey in the field right now. Anybody who is a member of ours would have gotten it. We're going to put a link to it on this on the Facebook page, and we would encourage you to give us some ammunition, which is what data really ultimately is for us. So help us tell the small business story in data by filling out that survey. We've already had almost 1,000 companies who've done so. So really, it helps us a lot to be able to speak on behalf of small businesses. As we kind of close out, Brian, we've got another webinar that we have teed up for tomorrow. It's really about the tax implications of both the PPP loan and the EIDL loan and the CARES Act more generally. We have a special guest on Tuesday. You want to talk about that one?
Yeah, the governor is going to come on this briefing on Tuesday, so Tuesday at 3. I love the timing of this. I originally asked if maybe she was available this week, and she's doing press conferences at 3 o'clock most days this week. But now that this compact, and I keep on saying compact because that's how I think of it in my head, but now this partnership has been developed. We know the Michigan Economic Recovery Council is really ramping up the work and reopening plans. I think Tuesday is going to be a really good time frame to get some insight about where things might go from here. But we're really thankful that Governor Whitmer would take the time to come on this show, because we know, obviously there's a lot of anxiety and frankly anger about about some of the steps and actions that could be taken. And the fact that she would come on here and talk with us, take it head on, is, I think, a good sign that as the decisions are made here in the coming weeks, very important decisions are made here in the coming weeks, that small businesses are going to have a voice in that process.
All right, I want to give you one final maybe caution. We're beginning to hear, we've heard from banking association, trade associations across the country that there are some scammers out there right now trying to lean into this PPP now that money is beginning to flow. And one of the scams is they pose as the SBA or as a bank in some cases, and they ask you to verify documents or sign documents electronically. And I would just caution you to be vigilant about this, to be suspicious. And if you see something that makes you suspicious, go back to your bank and make sure it's legit. That's all we have today. So hope to see you again tomorrow at 3 o'clock. In the meantime, remember to wash your hands.
And don't touch your face. And also, one more thing, fill out the survey, please. I'd like to have 10,000 responses rather than 1,000. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow.